Hello, welcome to the show. The global tech landscape is dominated by a handful of giant American corporations. And for all of its human capital and history of scientific achievement, Europe has never produced a Google, an Amazon, a Facebook, an Apple or a Microsoft, certainly not on anything like that scale. Now, my guest today wants Europe to become a tech powerhouse, and she comes from a country that is at the heart of the so-called Nordic tech boom, Sweden. She's Jessica Rosencrantz, the Swedish Minister for EU Affairs. She's from the Moderate Party, a centrist party that is part of the three-way coalition led by Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you so much.
Let's start with the fallout from the war in the Middle East, and we have this energy crisis now, obviously, in Europe. The European Commission now is saying it's probably going to revise downwards its economic forecast that it gives this spring. This is all going to be very bad for EU competitiveness, isn't it? Which you're very much championing, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a very disturbing world in many ways at the moment. And of course, what's happening in the Middle East now has a direct effect on energy prices and on our economies. And I think we need to have focus on what we can do back home here in Europe to sort of dampen the effects. Meanwhile, of course, we're also discussing what we can do more directly. But not least, we have a direct possibility to affect what's going on here. So, of course, meeting the spikes that we see in energy prices is really important here now to help consumers and businesses. But it shouldn't take the focus from what we also need to do in the long run, or in parallel, I would say. We need to keep our eyes on the prize, so to say, and that is to boost competitiveness in general through simplification, fulfilling the single market, and of course also, what's going on now really shows that being dependent on fossil fuels from the Middle East or from Russia, that's a bad strategy. It's bad for climate, it's bad for the economy, and it's bad for security.
We'll come back to that, but just on the sort of political aspect of this energy crisis, we've seen populists gaining ground in some parts of Europe, and there are elections happening, including in Sweden, of course, in September, I think. And recent polls have actually shown your party, the Moderates, behind the hard-right Sweden Democrats. Do you think this energy crisis is going to be a gift to your political opponents and to opponents of mainstream parties across Europe?
I think it's difficult to tell how crises affect support for a sitting government or opposition parties. It can sometimes go both ways. I think a lot depends on how you handle a crisis. And more importantly, it's important to handle a crisis as such. We need to make sure that we have the Swedish people's back when it comes to handling the crisis.
There could be fuel rationing, I think Ulf Kristersson was saying. He's not taking it off the table.
We're not taking it off the table, but here now we're putting in place measures to dampen the effects of the spikes in prices, reducing the tax on electricity, for one example, or also on fossil fuels, to make sure that here and now consumers and businesses can handle the effects. But moving forward, we'll see what other measures we will have to take.
Let's switch a little bit to talking about the whole tech landscape. And of course, you've been visiting France here. What do you think is the real difference? Because, of course, there is this Nordic tech boom, and people say that in France it's more of a conservative, less risk-taking culture than in the Nordic states or in Sweden. Do you think that's true? What are the differences, and maybe what could France perhaps learn from the Swedish tech boom?
Well, I would say that both France and Sweden are, at the forefront when it comes to tech and AI. And we have many good examples of French companies as well as Swedish companies really leading the way when it comes to innovation and tech. So I think we can probably learn from each other. In Sweden right now, I'm on a tech tour to visit entrepreneurs, asking them what we can do to create better conditions for companies to start, scale, and stay in Europe. But now I'm also taking the tech tour to Paris, since I'm visiting also Mistral. And Mistral actually quite recently announced a huge investment, the biggest one outside of France, in Sweden. And we also have Swedish companies investing in France. So here's a good partnership going on.
I get it. But what's the main barrier then, would you say, to scaling up from these, tech companies? Is it the fragmentation of the single market? Is it some other factor? What's the main barrier, would you say?
So, I'm very proud of the Swedish tech scene. We are ranked number one in innovation in the EU, number two actually in the world. In Sweden, it's described as a hobby to invest in stocks and funds. 4 out of 10 have an investment savings account. 70% of Swedes invest in funds. So I would say when I meet entrepreneurs, one obstacle for when it comes to scaling and staying in Europe is really about capital. So I would say that's one crucial component where I think also we from Sweden could export our model when it comes to capital markets to the rest of Europe. But that also makes for national reforms, creating investment savings accounts or pension funds that do investments. So that would be one crucial aspect. But of course also reducing bureaucracy, simplification, which we're all talking about in Europe. But we need to go from just words to concrete action. We're doing it with all these different omnibus packages, as it's being called, the simplification packages. But we need more of those, and the Swedish government has been quite active in, for example, the digital omnibus on AI, which specifically is important to create real good conditions for entrepreneurs and tech companies to be able to, as we say, start, scale, but also stay in Europe.
I'd like to talk to you as well about Sweden and Ukraine. And of course, Sweden recently approved another assistance package for Ukraine. It's worth reminding our viewers that out of the top European military providers or top European providers of military aid to Ukraine in 2025, Sweden ranks third, just after Germany and the United Kingdom, with 3.7 billion euros in military aid in 2025. How do you see this whole relationship going forward now that the 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine has been unblocked by the EU?
Well, first of all, the fact that we could finally take the decision on the 90 billion euro loan was, that's something that we've been working on for a long time from a Swedish point of view. I'm very glad for the new position from Hungary on this. It's crucial, but it's not enough. So we need to continue to put in place more support to Ukraine. Sweden has a 2-point plan, which is quite simple. It's about more support to Ukraine and more pressure on Russia. And these two things we need to continue to do. So more support, but also new sanctions packages on Russia, for example, will be necessary going forward.
A word about the incoming Prime Minister in Hungary, Peter Magyar. Of course, he's very different from Orbán in many ways, but he seems also a bit of a Ukraine skeptic. He says he doesn't see Ukraine in the EU in the next 10 years, and he might actually want to hold a referendum on Ukrainian membership in the EU in Hungary at some point during the process or at the end of it. Are you a bit disappointed by this kind of rhetoric from Peter Magyar?
I think we still don't know exactly what the position from the Hungarian government will be on all files lying ahead of us or when it comes to Ukraine, but other policies as well. So we'll see. But of course, it was an important step with the 90 billion loan and also with the sanctions package. I think there will be, a lot of member states now are discussing how exactly to advance when it comes to the Ukrainian future membership. From the Swedish point of view, we're quite clear that support to Ukraine in all aspects, it's a moral obligation, but it's also in our own interest because the Ukrainian people are fighting, as we say, not just for their freedom, but for the entire security of Europe. So we need to make sure that support to Ukraine in general is held on a high level and continues to advance. Also, Ukraine belongs in the European family, but we say also from the Swedish point of view that it's a merit-based approach. Any candidate country, also Ukraine, has to do the reforms, but we, from the EU, we shouldn't be the ones blocking. It should be about the reform pace in Ukraine, and they're doing a lot of reforms. We should be able to open up negotiations and start the process. And here I'm hoping, of course, that also Hungary will follow this line.
You mentioned energy dependence and independence earlier, Minister, and recently 5 EU governments signed a letter to the European Commission urging the EU to stick to its climate ambitions for 2040. 3 of those 5 signatory states were Nordic countries. Why is there this sort of Nordic awareness of that climate goal? And is it under threat, actually? Are there countries not pulling their weight and taking Europe away from that goal?
Well, I think many Nordic countries and definitely Sweden sees that having ambitious climate targets is, of course, important for climate as such, but it's also important for our competitiveness. I see these two things completely interlinked in many ways. And many of the Swedish companies, they've done a lot of reforms already. They've already shifted a lot of their processes to fulfill the different requirements from our climate framework. So I think we should not now punish those who have done their homework. But also, to me, it's obvious that the future is fossil-free. Like I mentioned before, being dependent on fossil fuels from the Middle East or from Russia, that's a really bad strategy, not just for climate, but also for security and for our economies. So we need to continue down this path. But I don't think it's just the Nordics saying this. I mean, I see that there's a broad support for this within the European Council, among my colleagues as well. Then there is a push, of course, from other countries. Of course, you can always have a discussion, on a detailed level, what we could do to make the system, well, not perfect, but even better. But don't, we have to stick to the targets, stick to the goals, and make sure, as we do now in the discussions, that we have an effective framework that is being set up. And that's what we're discussing right now. And
not punish those who've actually made the progress towards the transition.
Exactly so.
We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for being our guest, Jessica Rosencrantz, the Swedish Minister for EU Affairs, speaking to me here on Talking Europe. Glad you could join us for this episode here on France 24.
Thank you.